The smoke was still there when she woke up. Not a lot. A thin ribbon threading through the ceiling vents of the barracks, carrying the faint chemical smell of whatever the Varek strike unit used to breach the outer wall. The EDC had been sweeping since Oro 300. Orin said they'd found 3 breach points, neutralized all of them. She said it like she was reading a maintenance report. Kira lay on her bunk and stared at the ceiling and thought about the scanner. She could still see it. That amber reticle, slow and methodical, sweeping the courtyard during the firefight, not targeting weapons, not tracking movement, looking for something specific, something it had a file on. It had found her, locked on, held. And then the unit was down and the scanner was dark and she was standing in the rubble with her hands shaking and a notification she hadn't opened yet. She hadn't touched it. Delta Squad spent the morning in debrief. Sergeant Orin ran it the way she ran everything, methodically, without sentiment. She went around the room in order. What did you see? What did you do? What would you do differently? Kira gave her answers in the same flat tone she'd learned from watching Orin, direct, minimal, no color. What she did not say, the system told me to help Marin. I broke my own concealment rules. The scanner locked on my bearer's signature and held for 4 seconds. Dax sat across the table. He didn't look at her once during the debrief. She'd learned that meant he was thinking hard. He was always most still when his mind was most active. When it was over, Orin dismissed them with a single instruction. Rest, no training rotation until 1400. Kira sat on her bunk, looked at the blinking notification, and thought, she's buying me time before I have to lie to her face again. She'd heard bearers talk about it. The anonymous ones. The ones who posted through encryption because the EDC made public disclosure a court-martial offense. They talked about notifications the way people talked about symptoms. What it feels like when the system wants your attention and you ignore it. One of them said it was like standing next to a sound you couldn't unhear. Not loud, just present. She understood that now. The notification had been sitting in the corner of her interface since 0347, during the firefight, during the blast that took out the east perimeter wall. It hadn't demanded anything, it hadn't pulsed or escalated. It just waited, with the particular patience of something that knew exactly how long it had. At 11:32, with the barracks empty and the smoke finally clear, Kira opened her system interface. She pressed yes. The Origin tab loaded differently this time. Entries 1 and 2 were still there. Their text dim but readable, the words she'd memorized without meaning to. Below them, entry 3 had always shown the same locked icon, the same message, but that message was gone. In its place, a loading bar she hadn't seen before. Not instant, not clean. It moved in stuttered increments like a file being reconstructed from partial data. She watched it crawl to 62%. Then it stopped. What appeared below was not a message from the system, not a quest, not a warning. It was 3 things: a date, a reference code, and a single word she didn't recognize. The date was 18 years ago, 17 years before the invasion. She read it 3 more times to make sure she wasn't misunderstanding. The date wasn't a mistake. The system wasn't approximating. The reference code beside it was a Varek classification string. She recognized the format from their first week intelligence briefings. Hexadecimal, 8 segments, Varek authority stamp. She sat very still. Her bearer signature was in the Varek database, not because they'd scanned her last night, not because their probe had found her 3 months ago in the gutter district. The registration date on this file was from before she existed, before the invasion, before the probes, before any of it. Somewhere, in a database she had no name for, Kira Voss was already on file, already flagged, already marked priority. The scanner last night hadn't discovered her. It had confirmed her. She closed the interface and sat in the silence for a long time. There was a version of this that made sense, where the Varek were scanning for power signatures, where her system had registered early, where the file was new data with a corrupted timestamp. She tried to build that version. She couldn't make it hold, because the date was specific, not a range, not an estimate, a date that fell 7 months before her birth, which meant whatever they had filed, whatever signature they had registered, it hadn't come from her. It had come from something else, something they had been tracking, something that had then found its way into a 17-year-old girl in the gutter district of New Chicago, without warning, without ceremony, through a probe scan that everyone had assumed was accidental. Nothing about this had been accidental. The system stayed quiet, no notification, no message, just the faint blue shimmer at the edge of her vision, patient as it always was. She thought, how long have you known? At 1400, she went to training. She didn't have a choice. Missing rotation raised questions, and questions were the one thing she couldn't afford, not with what she'd just read sitting behind her eyes like a splinter she couldn't reach. Concealment was first on the rotation. She knew before she tried that it wasn't going to work. She'd felt the hollow since EP4's battle, the place where that skill used to be, like a muscle that had torn and hadn't healed. Using it under crisis conditions without completing the stability requirement had cost her. The system had made that explicit. She stood in the training yard, reached for the skill, and felt nothing. Across the yard, Dax was running combat drills, precise in a way that had become sharper since Stage 5. His movements were clean in a way that no longer looked like training. The red system was doing that, refining him, replacing the margin of error in his technique with something that felt mechanical from the outside. She watched him and thought, is that what good looks like? Or is that what obedient looks like? He'd hit Stage 5 12 days ago. She knew because the system had told her, not directly, but in the way it sometimes logged external bearer proximity data without being asked. A background annotation. She hadn't mentioned it to him. He hadn't mentioned it to her. That was how they operated by unspoken agreement, not because of mistrust, but because some information felt safer held separately. What she'd noticed in the 4 days since was that he'd stopped hesitating. Not the way good training removes hesitation, the way something else removes it. His red system issued combat commands in a sequence that had become almost visible in his movements. Efficient, relentless, correct. She didn't know what Stage 6 looked like. She wasn't sure he did either, but she remembered something from EP4's battle. When she'd broken cover to help Marin, his system had done something unusual. The machine's smoothness had faltered. 1 beat, a fraction of a second. She hadn't forgotten it. It happened at 1547. She was in the 3rd circuit of the Concealment Restoration Protocol, running a precision movement exercise, trying to rebuild the skill's baseline from nothing. When the notification landed, she stopped moving. The quest was unlike anything her system had issued before. Not a training directive, not a survival threshold, a location, a real location. District 4, New Chicago, somewhere in the city she'd lived her entire life. She read it twice, then a 3rd time. Then she looked up. Across the training yard, Dax had stopped too. He was standing completely still, not the controlled stillness of a drilled soldier, but the stillness of someone who had just read something they weren't ready for. His hand was at his side. His eyes were on the middle distance. At the edge of her vision, his interface showed a faint, crimson shimmer. He turned and looked at her. She looked back. Neither of them said a word. She didn't tell him about the quest. He didn't tell her. They went back to their respective rotations without speaking, and for the rest of the afternoon she moved through the Concealment Restoration Protocol with a focus that had nothing to do with the drill and everything to do with the fact that she needed that skill back before she could go anywhere near District 4. The protocol was clear. She'd run Stage 1 before, in the beginning, when the system was new. It had been difficult then. It was harder now, because she understood what it cost. Concealment didn't make her invisible. It made her unremarkable. and unremarkable meant suppressing every instinct to react, to flinch at a sound, to track a movement, to let the system's awareness show in her body. It meant becoming, for 30 seconds at a time, someone with nothing to hide. She was not that person anymore. She completed stage 1 on the 4th attempt. The first 3 times, something broke her. A noise, a flicker in her peripheral vision, the weight of what she'd read in the Origin tab pressing against her stillness like a hand on her chest. The 4th time, she made it to 3 minutes by thinking about nothing. Not the Varek file, not the date, not the quest in District 4. Nothing. Stage 2 was worse. Movement under observation meant crossing the training yard while the EDC monitoring system was active. The sensor net that tracked bearer ability flares in real time. 10 meters. No flicker in the system's ambient signature. No tell. She made it 8 meters before the system pulsed. She reset. Took a breath. Tried again. The difference between the first time she'd built concealment and the second time was this. The first time, she hadn't known what the system was watching for. The second time, she did. She knew the exact shape of what she was trying to suppress, which meant she knew exactly how much she was revealing by trying. On the 3rd attempt, she made 10 meters. Stage 3 was the trigger. 30 seconds. Ability active, controlled, no cascade. She held it for 22 seconds the first time, 31 on the second. On the 3rd attempt, she held it for 44. She let out a breath she hadn't known she was holding. Then, almost as an afterthought, the way the system sometimes delivered things, like it had been waiting for the right moment, a second notification appeared. The reward from EP4's optional quest. Delayed until now, until she'd demonstrated she could function under the cost. She closed the interface. It was the first clean win she'd had in 3 days. She didn't let herself enjoy it for long because somewhere at the edge of her awareness, Sergeant Orin was standing at the yard's edge, watching the monitoring station's readout with the particular stillness of someone who had seen exactly what they expected to see. Orin didn't say anything. That was the part that stayed with Kira. Not what Orin said, but the precise quality of her silence. A commander who identified an ability flare in her monitoring station would ask about it, would log it, would run a formal bearer check request through EDC Protocol 7. Orin did none of those things. She looked at the readout. She looked at Kira. And then she looked away. 1 second too long. Kira had watched enough people conceal things to know what concealment looked like from the outside. She'd spent weeks learning to suppress her own tells, and what she saw in Orin in that moment was not ignorance. It was not suspicion. It was recognition. The burn scar on Orin's forearm caught the afternoon light as she turned back to her station. Kira had never asked about it. No one in Delta Squad had. It had the quality of something you didn't ask about, like a rank insignia from a unit that no longer existed. She filed the moment away and said nothing. Some things you wait to understand. That night, she read Entry 3 again. She'd been turning the 3 fragments over in her head for hours. The date, the reference code, the single 7-character word she didn't recognize. A proper noun, she was certain, capitalized in Varek authority format. Not a name from any briefing, not a district, a sector, a registered facility, a name for something that didn't have a public record. But the quest hadn't given her a word. It had given her coordinates. Grid reference Delta 7, District 4. She pulled up New Chicago's district map from the system's data layer and cross-referenced. District 4 was the old manufacturing quarter, abandoned since the first wave. Too exposed, too close to what the EDC called the Varek Transit Corridor. Most of it had been rubble for 3 years. She looked at the exact grid marker. It wasn't rubble. The map showed a structure. Pre-invasion, possibly older. No designation in the EDC registry. No maintenance flag. Just a building that had somehow survived intact in the middle of everything the Varek had leveled. She sat in the dark and let herself think the thought she'd been avoiding all day. The Varek hadn't come to occupy New Chicago. She'd known that in the back of her mind since the briefings. The probe patterns, the scan sequences, the way their strike units moved through a district like something looking for a specific address rather than clearing territory. She'd filed it as tactic. Alien logic she didn't have the context to read. Now she had a data point she couldn't explain away. Her bearer signature was on file before the invasion began, which meant one of two things. The Varek had known system bearers would exist before any bearer had awakened, meaning they had foreknowledge of the systems themselves, or the file predated the Varek entirely. The systems had been sent. Entry 212 had used that word deliberately. She'd assumed it meant sent to her and Dax. She was beginning to understand it meant something older than that. The building in District 4, pre-invasion, intact. The Varek hadn't destroyed it, which meant they needed it. She found out about Dax at 2200, not from him, from the monitoring station alert that pinged through the barracks network. Automatic, logged EDC standard protocol. A bearer had advanced a stage, red system, forward base Sigma. She read it from her system's proximity log, the background layer that tracked him, quiet and automatic, like a compass that had found its north. 2 stages from Stage 7. She didn't know what Stage 7 looked like, for him or for her. But she remembered the moment in EP4's battle when his system had paused, when the smooth sequence of combat commands had stuttered for exactly 1 beat, when something human had flickered through. She thought about the quest they'd both received at 1547, the same location, the same time. Neither of them had told the other. 2 systems, 1 coordinate. She thought about his stillness in the training yard when the notification landed, the way he'd looked at her, the way she'd looked back. She didn't think he was going to District 4 alone. At 0300, she pulled the map one more time. She'd been doing it every hour since she found the building, checking that it was still there, that the system hadn't updated the entry to say, wrong coordinate. We made an error. It hadn't. The building sat in District 4, grid reference Delta 7, intact and unregistered in the middle of 3 years of leveled rubble. The quest timer read 69 hours. She thought about what it meant that the Varek needed it. She thought about the 7-character word in Entry 3 that she didn't have a name for yet. She thought about Orin looking at her for 1 second too long. And then, at the edge of the map, where the system rendered data from sources she didn't know it had access to, she saw something she hadn't noticed before, a heat signature, recent, within the last 48 hours. Not Varek. Something had been in that building since the battle. She closed the interface. She wasn't going to sleep tonight. Nobody had told her any of this would work this way. She'd been given a system and a set of quests, and the implicit understanding that if she completed them, she'd get stronger, that there was a logic to it, a ladder with rungs she could count. She'd built herself to that, trained herself to trust it. The Origin tab had 12 entries. She had 62% of the 3rd one. She was on file in a Varek database that predated her birth. There was a building in District 4 that the invasion hadn't touched, and something had been inside it in the last 48 hours, and her system had a mandatory quest with 69 hours left on the clock. And somewhere in this base, a Stage 6 bearer was lying in the dark with the same coordinates she had, and neither of them had said a word to the other. She thought, I don't know what I am, but they do. The system pulsed once. Blue, quiet, and then it was dark. This has been Kira, System Awakened, Episode 5, Origin, Entry 3. If you want to know what's in District 4 and what found it before she did, subscribe. Episode 6 is coming.